Unlike previous centuries where leadership was defined by royalty and other rulers, the 20th century, more than any other, was shaped by the will and actions of the common man. In the episodes of this series, we'll examine some of the defining events in each of 15 different periods. Our aim is to experience what it was like for the common man to be alive then. Politics and technology made this the killing century, but they also provided extended life and hope. In this first episode, we'll see that as the century began, there was no place on earth where hope flourished more than in the United States of America. In 1900, in the countries of Central and Southern Europe, tens of millions of people were trapped in miserable lives.
They were starving, and things were real tough, because when my father was a young boy at 12 or 13 years old, he was sent to a family in Cairo, Egypt, to become a vassal. That's what they did with their sons.
Peasants, they never got paid, they never made a living, they lived in huts. The Jewish people certainly were poverty-stricken. They didn't have a darn thing.
My people came from peasants. My grandparents on both sides of the family came from Sicily. My mother's side of the family came from a town called Cimina. In the small villages, what was there? Oppression and no food.
One place held the promise of a better future.
My mother and father, they heard about America from others, and they knew that America was heaven. It was once in America, all problems would be solved. There would be food, there would be freedom, there would be no persecution. Freedom, freedom. An incredible word for those people.
This country is in a state of unexampled prosperity. We are furnishing profitable employment to the millions of working men throughout the United States.
By 1900, the United States leads in every major industrial product. I mean, we're producing more steel, we're producing more machine goods, textiles. The United States has 1/3 of all the railroad trackage in the world. For the first time in human history, people can move over land swiftly, easily, reliably.
The average American lived longer, was better fed and better paid, and had greater access to education than the average citizen anywhere else on earth.
This is the great land of opportunity. No matter how low you may be born, no matter how humble you may be, you can rise to the top. The sky is the limit.
On the eve of the new century, the sense of boundless possibilities also ignited an explosion of technological innovations that would have profound impact on 20th century life. Thomas Edison's electric light bulb and phonograph, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Tens of thousands of tinkerers across America were trying to invent the future. Among them were two bicycle mechanics in Dayton, Ohio.
Orville and Wilbur, they as young boys were interested in flying. They would sit on the porch and watch the birds. And the neighbors all around us say, I don't know what they think they're going to do, why they will never make an airplane.
Mabel Greep and her sister Lorene lived next door to the Wright brothers.
Well, my father found out some way that they were going to have a trial flight. So we got in the Surrey and we drove out to Huffman Prairie.
I can hear Dad turn more than once and say, look, are you all paying attention to this? Now listen to me. You're going to remember this till your last day. When that plane took off the ground, people were speechless. It was spectacular. It was unbelievable.
One of the oldest dreams in human imagination had come true: sustained flight in a powered aeroplane.
The United States was without question the most inventive nation in the world in that period. It is comparable in its creativity to the Renaissance in Italy, for example, to the period of Elizabeth in English history, the Shakespearean period. Americans appreciated the new. They assumed that change was the natural course of history.
And on America's roads, the European novelty was about to be reinvented.
The first time we saw a car when I was a kid, well, that was for people out of this world.
In 1900, there were only 8,000 cars and less than 10 miles of concrete road in the entire country. The car was fast seducing Americans.
The automobile gave people a sense of the control of their own destiny. That is, behind the wheel, out on the road, you decided where you were going, what you were doing. You had a machine at your control.
But early cars were fantastically expensive. The Artsberger, made in Pittsburgh, and the Pierce Arrow were really toys for the rich people. Until one manufacturer in Detroit saw it differently. Henry Ford.
He saw the automobile as a way to relieve one of the burden of working in nature by the sweat of one's brow. He was motivated by the desire to put the automobile into the hands of first farmers and then generally into the hands of ordinary people in the population. He wanted to produce many, many, many automobiles in a short time. Ford had this vision of smooth flow using an assembly line. These components were coming from up here. These components were on an endless lift. These components were coming on a belt, and everything is in motion. And I think the image of a number of streams flowing into a river captures the assembly line concept.
Henry Ford's Model T was introduced in 1908 at the price of $825.
I think it would have been considered un-American in his eyes to produce an automobile for rich people. That's what foreigners do. Americans generally were committed to the proposition that every man and every woman should enjoy material abundance. That was the American spirit. That's America.
It was the promise of material abundance and freedom which drew more than 13 million impoverished Europeans to America between 1900 and 1914. They came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Russia, and from Italy. It was the greatest free migration in all of human history.
My mother's mother, Domenica, was afraid to travel on the boat. And the only way they got her on the boat was her brother tricked her. He went on the boat with her and said he was going with her. And at the last minute, she turned away and he left.
My mother came by herself through Siberia. She got to the coast and got on a boat. They were just sitting on the deck, hordes of people huddled over their possessions, which consisted of old pillows with feathers and the few pieces of silverware tucked in there and stuff like that, the candlesticks, and sleeping on the deck with one another, next to one another, to keep oneself warm. It took weeks and weeks and weeks. It took ages.
When I crossed the ocean, I never saw such waves in my life. I never knew an ocean existed. Approaching the New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty was there, and it gave me a free feeling of liberty, a feeling of a new nation, a feeling of a new hope for a beautiful life.
There's something wonderful about being an immigrant. There's something so deliciously naive and happy about being an immigrant who has escaped from something. My father would say from time to time, no matter how bad things were, at least we're free.
In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it was said prosperity was measured by the thickness of the soot in the air.
Oh man, what about them furnaces let loose? The whole sky was full of red dust. Full of red dust. If you had your wash out, you had your laundry out, it was too bad. You had to run outside and pull that laundry in because it'd be covered in red dust. You would see them coal mines lit up from Greensburg all the way to Uniontown. It was wonderful to see it.
Relentless production in Pittsburgh's steel mills, foundries, and coal mines attracted an enormous number of immigrants, and poor whites and blacks from the rural South. It was their labor which fed the furnace of industrial America.
You had to pick everything up. You had to move everything by hand. No lunch breaks of any kind. You worked and you had a sandwich in your hand. If you had to go to the restroom, boom, back right away. They timed you. Well, you get home at night, you couldn't lift your arms up. I remember this. Oh, I remember this distinctly. My father would come home and say to my mother, rub my arms a little bit, because they were picking up. There was no, it was all mule work.
I had two uncles that worked in the mill. It was dangerous. No safety precautions were in the mills. You could walk in the mill and see people with one arm, one leg. You had an accident in the mills almost every 2 days, but nobody did anything about it.
There was no compensation for the injuries and death on the job, and it was almost impossible for workers in the early part of the century to organize.
They tried to start a union, and of course they had the coal and iron police, they were called in those days. And they would bust a lot of heads, and a lot of murders were committed, and a lot of things that you daresn't say too much. If you worked in a mill, if your boss said something to you, that was it, that was the law.
Industrial work involved 6 days a week, 12 to 16 hours a day. The daily wage, barely $2. Children, too, were made to work, 2 million of them across America, some as young as 4.
They did not complain as adults tended to do. Employers liked to think of them as happy elves.
E.L. Doctorow wrote about child labor in his novel of life in the early century, Ragtime.
They were more agile than adults, but they tended in the latter hours of the day to lose a degree of efficiency. In the canneries and mills, these were the hours they were most likely to lose their fingers or have their hands mangled or their legs crushed. In the mines, they worked as sorters of coal and sometimes were smothered in the coal chutes.
As a child, in the early part of the century, Pauline Newman worked 13-hour days in a New York garment sweatshop, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
We had a corner on the floor that resembled a kindergarten. You were not allowed to sing. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. The door was locked to keep us in.
The locked doors would prove to be fatal. On March the 25th, 1911, fire broke out at the factory with an exit door locked on the 9th floor many workers jumped to their death.
I was 11, and I remember all of a sudden all of East New York went crazy because the kids were running around with the newspapers hollering extra that all these people had died in that fire.
– 146 workers died. There were no sprinklers inside the factory then. There had never been a fire drill. The tragedy outraged a public that had become increasingly aware of both the underside of a prosperous nation and the need for reform.
The great reform movement of this period is called progressivism.